Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to you all, and thank you all very much indeed for coming out tonight. I know you've all had a very busy day in and around Edinburgh, so I really appreciate the time that you're giving me this evening. Before I begin my talk this evening, let me just remind you about an offer that I always like to make to cruise guests, because I hope it's helpful. Quite simply, if you have any questions that arise from this evening's talk, or any of my previous talks on Viking Sun, please don't be shy with me. Instead, always feel free to ask those questions whenever you see me around the ship, morning, afternoon or evening, or I know we've only got one more day on land, haven't we? But if you see me out and about on the shore excursion in London, again, I'm always available to receive those questions if you wish. If you have any immediately burning questions that have to be asked right after the talk, I can't take them around the stage area because the technical guys have to change the stage area for the next event, but I can take them immediately outside the theatre right after the talk, so I hope that is helpful. But I think I hope we'll all agree that if there's one place, ladies and gentlemen, that sums up the British Isles in the minds of many visitors from all over the world, yes, it is probably Buckingham Palace, isn't it, in London. So today I want to have a good look at the history of this iconic place. And then I'm going to spend some time looking at the royal collection of paintings and other art, a lot of which is housed inside Buckingham Palace, because it is one of the world's great art collections, certainly one of the great British art collections. It is an integral part of the history of Buckingham Palace as well. But when we look at the palatial grandeur of Buckingham Palace that we have on the slide there, it's really hard to imagine, if we were to go back to the Middle Ages, medieval times, that this whole area that we're looking at on the slide today was actually only marshland. That's all it was back then. And it was marshy because of the Tyburn, which is a stream which actually still to this day flows right under the courtyard of Buckingham Palace, under the south wing in actual fact. But if we press the fast forward button on history from those medieval days, let's go to the year 1703, where we encounter not Buckingham Palace, but we encounter Buckingham House. And it was Buckingham House that formed the architectural core of Buckingham Palace that, of course, we know today. So the story pretty much all started around here. And we know that Buckingham House was a townhouse of a guy called John Sheffield, and he had a fantastic title. First Duke of Buckingham and Normanby. And he was a very successful politician around the time of George I. Later on, by the year 1761, one of John Sheffield's descendants actually sold Buckingham House to King George III. Now, bearing in mind London property prices, how much do you think it was back in those days? £21,000. How times have changed, ladies and gentlemen. How property prices in London have changed. £21,000 sold to King George III. So that was how Buckingham House first became into the ownership of the British royal family. So once more, I need to lightly touch the fast-forward button on history. I'm moving forward to the year 1800, and I'm showing you what I think is a very interesting painting. I can't tell you who painted it because no one knows. It is interesting, though, because it shows us far more than just the house, because we see ladies and gentlemen of that era in their beautiful costumes all strolling around St James's Park. Now, the reason why King George III actually bought Buckingham House was originally to give his wife a private retreat from all the pressures and the endless formality of living in the British royal court. So King George III's wife was this lady. Here's a beautiful portrait, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. And we know that 14 out of her 15 children, yes, you heard me right, 14 out of 15 children were actually born at Buckingham House. You might actually be wondering where the British royal family actually lived back in those days before Buckingham House or Buckingham Palace became their main London address. Well, the answer is they mixed it up a little bit. They had different townhouses, so part of their time they spent here at Kew Palace. And they also spent their time at an address more or less opposite Kew Palace, which bizarrely was called the White House. I'm not kidding. It was. And in actual fact, King George III actually had a hand in designing Kew Palace, but the main London address for the British royal family at that time was this place, St James's Palace, and of course you all know who designed this. Well, you know his name, Henry VIII, the famous king himself. Anyway, let's get back to the year 1761, shall we? Buckingham House, as it was, had been sold to King George III for that outrageous sum of London property prices, £21,000. But the following year, the builders just had to be called in for a lot of reworking on the place. And then after 1820, King George IV continued to rework the building. So by the time we get to the year 1837, well, look at the slide. It looks a lot closer to the Buckingham Palace that we're more familiar with. The architect that did a lot of this work is a name that we need to remember, John Nash. And actually, John Nash was responsible for a great deal of the Regency appearance of London. You'll be seeing it for yourself. You'll be seeing a lot of John Nash's work. So if your excursion goes along Regent Street, well, that was Nash's work. And elsewhere, if you're able to spend more time in England, a place on the south coast of England called Brighton. John Nash was responsible for the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. But when we think about Buckingham Palace as being one of the great symbols of the British Isles, and of course it is, it might come as a lot of surprise that when we realise that a lot of John Nash's architectural designs is French, not British at all. The style that we're seeing here is French neoclassical architecture because that was King George IV's preference, and the royalty in those days has a lot more power than they do today, so what he wanted is what he got. What the man wanted was French neoclassical architecture, a very extravagant style, certainly a more extravagant response to the clean lines of other classical or neoclassical architecture. And that extravagance was most definitely French in origin. The problem was, though, that it's great to have extravagant ideas, but they were so expensive that even for the British royal family, they couldn't tolerate John Nash's outrageous designs, so he had to leave. He was given the boot. So by the time we come to King William IV, came to the throne in the year 1830, one of the ideas he thought of during his reign was to have the Houses of Parliament, Westminster and around there, integrated within Buckingham Palace. Now, it might sound a strange thing to think about, but there was logic, because the reason why he was given very serious attention to that idea, because in the latter part of the year 1834 and around 1835, that was when the debate was going on. The reason why they were thinking that, because in 1834, the Houses of Parliament had been burnt down. And the official reason for that burning down of the old Houses of Parliament was because a stove was meant to become overheated, resulting in a fire quite close to some very dry wood indeed. And before anybody knew what was going on, the entire Palace of Westminster had been destroyed by fire. Anyway, getting back to Buckingham Palace, shall we move on to the year 1837? That's definitely, looking at this place, it's definitely looking like the Buckingham Palace that we know. But in this year, 1837, very, very important in the history of Buckingham Palace, because that was when the Buckingham Palace became the main royal residence. And the reason why that decision was actually taken is because the lady on the throne at that time, Queen Victoria, just loved Buckingham Palace. 1837, by the way, it was the date when Queen Victoria actually came onto the throne. And the reason why Queen Victoria absolutely loved Buckingham Palace, the real thing that sealed the deal for her, she just loved the staterooms. Why? Because they were just amazingly lavish. They really appealed to her sense of aesthetics. So today, let's think about those staterooms. First of all, what are the Buckingham Palace staterooms all about? What do they mean? Well, staterooms in the context of a British royal palace, they are the rooms in any palace where the monarch meets visitors. That's why you have staterooms. So they make a real big statement of power about the monarch. One of the functions of staterooms is to serve as a location for award ceremonies. So when you have medals being given out, that's taking place in one of the staterooms, or visiting monarchs, or visiting dignitaries, such as visiting presidents and people of that calibre. So staterooms are the public face of Buckingham Palace. That's what I'm saying. So let's have a swift tour around, because even on imaginary tours, we can access all these areas. The state dining rooms, I think, is a really good example. It just looks incredible, doesn't it? All that gold leaf, it really makes a big statement. So I think it's very easy to see why Queen Victoria absolutely fell in love with all those amazing staterooms, and why she wanted Buckingham Palace to be her main residence. But for us today, ladies and gentlemen, shall we just carry on having a look around some of the other staterooms, because they are worth looking at. Even the corridors between these staterooms are pretty spectacular, aren't they? And this one as well, this is called the Blue Drawing Room, and it's another one of the magnificent staterooms within Buckingham Palace. Makes the whole palace look completely magnificent. In all, as it's a question I've always asked, how many staterooms are there in Buckingham Palace? There are 19 staterooms in Buckingham Palace, and basically they all reflect the very extravagant taste of King George IV, who reigned between the years 1820 and 1830. That was a while before Queen Victoria came to the throne. But another question that I'm often asked, great question, where did George IV get all that amazing furniture from? Because you can't just snap your fingers and get all that done. Well, it actually moved from Carlton House, which used to be a mansion on the south side of Pall Mall in central London, near to St James's Park. Carlton House was actually the previous home of King George IV while he was still Prince Regent. So when he became king, he thought, well, I just love all my furniture, I'm going to take it with me. So all his furniture came with him, and the chandeliers, they were unbolted, they came with him too. Even his favourite candelabra, they also came from Carlton House to Buckingham Palace. But for me, I think it's the paintings that really help to tell the story of the history of Buckingham Palace. And the staterooms, they are so interesting. These paintings tell stories. This is one of my favourites. It's by Anthony van Dyck, and it shows King Charles I, painted in the year 1633. And again, a question that I'm always asked, so I'm going to answer it now. And the question is, who's the other guy in the bottom right-hand corner? Well, he had a really impressive title. I'm going to give you his full title, Pierre-Antoine Bourbon, Seigneur de Saint-Antoine. And Monsieur Bourbon was the riding master of King Charles I. So it's just a little taste from his life reflected in the overall history of Buckingham Palace. But if we dig further into the realities of living in Buckingham Palace, we find that all behind all this glitz and glamour and the palatial staterooms, the reality of living in the place was far less appealing than many people assume. Because during the early years of Queen Victoria's reign, we know that most of the fireplaces in Buckingham Palace smoked so badly that it was better to put those fires out rather than to absolutely choke on all the soot and the smoke which came out. And that applied even in winter time, ladies and gentlemen. So although the appearance of Buckingham Palace appeared to be absolutely amazing superficially and from the outside, the reality was for most of the year it was basically a freezing cold building to live in. And as if the freezing cold wasn't bad enough, we also know that Buckingham Palace's ventilation during the early reign of Queen Victoria was so bad the place often smelled really awful. In actual fact, when gas lamps were installed into Buckingham Palace, there were serious worries, and we have minuted meetings that the gas would actually be a fire hazard as well. So when Queen Victoria married the love of her life, Prince Albert, in the year 1840, he was was amazed and frankly disgusted that his bride had to live in a freezing cold, badly smelling, unsafe building. So immediately he gave himself the job of changing that and getting the fireplaces cleaned properly, and not just a gentle sweeping, but done properly. Proper ventilation was installed again on the orders of Prince Albert, and pretty quickly Buckingham Palace really became comfortable for the first time in many, many years, all thanks to this man's initiative and enterprise. But when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert had more and more children, they felt that the place needed to expand a lot more. So they ordered the construction of a massive new wing, which is located behind the famous East Front. You know, the famous front that I was showing you initially. That's the east front. So the new wing surrounds the central quadrangle, which is absolutely at the heart of Buckingham Palace as it is today. It was designed by Edward Blore. The builder was called Thomas Cubitt. And when they had the builders in, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert they thought, what else do we need? Oh, I know, a ballroom. We'll have a ballroom. Yes, throw in a ballroom just for good measure. So they did. But Prince Albert certainly made his mark on the cultural fabric of Buckingham Palace, because alongside improving the heating and the ventilation and reducing the fire hazards, he started to invite some very famous musicians to actually come and not only visit Buckingham Palace, but to perform there for the royal family and their guests. Now, one of the first that they had was this gentleman, Felix Mendelssohn. He was a fantastic pianist from the early part of the Romantic era. But what an amazing experience it must have been for the royal family and their guests. Oh, what's the show tonight? Oh, well, let's have a look on the daily programme. Oh, Felix Mendelssohn's turning up. Well, that'll do nicely. So it must have been a fantastic thing. And then, of course, as they became more bold in the invitations they sent out, this gentleman was invited, Johann Strauss II. But he really wanted to make a big splash, whereas Mendelssohn turned up to play the piano. Johann Strauss really was far more ambitious. He just rolled up with his entire orchestra. And so he was playing some of his favourite music, like the Blue Danube, of course, and Tales from the Vienna Woods as well. But it's clear that Johann Strauss II really just absolutely loved his time at Buckingham Palace. He composed a piece of music, the Alice Polka, especially for Princess Alice, basically as a thank you to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert for inviting him along. So music really had a growing role within the cultural fabric of Buckingham Palace from around the 1840s, and that continues today, of course. But in that terrible year, the year of heartbreak, 1861, Prince Albert passed away, and Queen Victoria was completely grief-stricken, and she found it totally impossible to spend any more time than she really had to within the walls of Buckingham Palace, because those walls had been the site of such fabulous, happy memories with her beloved Prince Albert. So Queen Victoria, for a while, actually left Buckingham Palace and went to live in Windsor Castle. And she went to live in Balmoral Castle in Scotland, and Osborne House, which is located on the Isle of Wight, which is an island just off the south coast of England. Anywhere that wasn't Buckingham Palace. And then an amazing story that I have to share with you. In the year 1864, a notice was pinned up on a board outside Buckingham Palace saying it was up for sale or rent, because Queen Victoria just could not bring herself to stay there. But pretty soon, Queen Victoria's advisors said, well, please return. You have to. It's symbolic. It's important. So grudgingly, reluctantly, she did come back there, but lived elsewhere wherever possible. In terms of the story of the building itself and how it's shaped, that's pretty much, without going into pedantic details, that's pretty much it. How big is the floor space of Buckingham Palace? Can you imagine putting this place up for sale? Central London residency, detached, 833,000 square feet of floor space. Well, I can't imagine what 833,000 square feet looks like. Can you imagine 7 soccer pitches? That's easier, isn't it? 7 soccer pitches is roughly 833,000 square feet. So imagine 7 soccer pitches. That's the total floor space of this incredible building. The statistics go on. I've already said that there's 19 staterooms, 52 principal bedrooms, 188 staff bedrooms. How many officers do you... Because this is a working palace. 92 officers. How many bathrooms do you think? 78. So fully working. During the First World War, here's another interesting story, just touching the fast-forward button on history. During the First World War, the royal family actually stayed living in Buckingham Palace, although the artwork, and I don't know whether this says anything about the relative value of the artwork compared to the British royal family, the artwork was actually moved out of Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle. So the royal family stayed there. The artwork, though, had to go to a safer place. I'm not going to pursue that one. We'll leave that one as an open question, shall we? But it's a rarely known fact that George V, who was on the throne at that time, imposed rationing on all the royal family and their guests too, as an act of solidarity with the austerity which was being experienced by the British people during the First World War. And by the way, that austerity also included no access to the wine cellars of Buckingham Palace either. And then there's some lovely stories, again, I need to share with you, from the Second World War as well. These are lovely stories. Buckingham Palace, of course, the bad side, inevitably it was bombed no less than 9 times. And in the year 1940, Buckingham Palace Chapel received a direct hit from a German bomb, and that was completely destroyed. The following year, 1941, a policeman who was on duty outside the palace, PC Steve Robertson, he was killed by flying debris. So the war stories were sad. But there is an amazing story. I wouldn't forgive myself for not telling you this. It took place on Battle of Britain Day, 15th of September 1940. What happened? A Royal Air Force pilot, Ray Holmes, 504 Squadron, he actually saw a German bomber flying directly towards Buckingham Palace, probably to bomb the place. Now, Ray Holmes had no more ammunition. He was coming back from his mission. But he flew over to the German bomber. He had no ammunition. What do you think he did? He actually rammed the German bomber right in the side, and then Holmes parachuted away to safety before the RAF aircraft and the German bomber crashed far away from Buckingham Palace, I'm pleased to say. And in actual fact, it caused minimal damage. It actually, if you're travelling through London, it ended up in the forecourt of London's Victoria Station. So that's a name that you might encounter when you're in London. But the German bomber, as it was falling out of the sky toward its pilot, actually managed to unload all its bombs, but only one bomb out of his entire casing hit Buckingham Palace, without causing too much damage, I hasten to say. So Ray Holmes basically saved Buckingham Palace. Fantastic bravery, but fantastic imagination as well. Even though he had no ammunition, didn't stop him from saving the day. How was he rewarded? He was actually rewarded by being given an extraordinary title. He became a king's messenger, and he kept that title until his death at the age of 90 in the year 2005. Now, what sort of a job is a king's messenger? Well, you get your special passport for one thing. You're employed by the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the job is basically you're a messenger. You carry important diplomatic papers around the world, and so that the position carries diplomatic immunity. One of the perks, though, if you're a king's messenger or queen's messenger, as you are today, you always fly business class. Now, you all want to be king's messenger or queen's messengers, don't you? But isn't that an interesting story from the history of Buckingham Palace? But during the reign of the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, Buckingham Palace is often in the news, isn't it? One of the most bizarre stories from a few years ago involved this gentleman, Michael Fagan. He actually got into the Queen's bedroom, unbelievably. I don't. It must have been too early for the security at that time. You kind of imagine that security around the Buckingham Palace is tightened up just a tad between then. But it was around breakfast time. It was 7 a.m., Friday, the 9th of July, 1982. And what happened was this gentleman, Michael Fagan, he managed to climb up over the 14-foot perimeter wall. Then he got himself over all the spikes that were on top of that 14-foot tall. And you can imagine, very gingerly indeed. He ran over to the palace. He shimmied up the drain pipe outside Buckingham Palace. And then probably to his surprise as much as Her Majesty's, found himself inside the Queen's bedroom, where he sat chatting to Her Majesty until security guards helped Mr. Fagan away from the premises. But the story doesn't end there. It has an interesting twist, because they thought, well, what do we charge him with? What crime can we charge him with? Actually, all he got was 6 months in a psychiatric hospital. It's all he got. Because when Michael Fagan broke into Buckingham Palace, there was no other law that could be changed with. Obviously, times change, and they learnt their lesson, so that through Parliament, where our laws are made, very hastily, a serious organised crime and police act of 2005 was passed, and that identified Buckingham Palace as a so-called designated place where trespass is most definitely a crime. So times change, stories change, and the law changes with it. But almost whenever I talk about Buckingham Palace, cruise guests often ask me about the gardens, the beautiful gardens. I've met a number of cruise guests who are actually going to Buckingham Palace, so make sure you have a good look at the beautiful gardens. It might be a good time for me to say something about them now. They're located at the rear of the palace. So they face west, and in all, the gardens cover 42 acres. That's a good, or if you prefer metric, 17 hectares, but 42 acres of beautifully manicured lawn. 2.5 miles of gravel path, by the way. And who designed them? Well, this gentleman was responsible, Capability Brown, and he basically, his background, he was arguably one of the greatest of Britain's 18th century landscape gardeners. He set out the structure and tone of the gardens at Buckingham Palace. And since the days of Capability Brown, several other garden designers have added their touch of magic, such as William Townsend Alton from Kew Gardens. He brought his magic as well. These days there are 8 full-time gardeners, and during the summer season there are 2 or 3 part-time gardeners added as well. And of course, there are the famous garden parties, aren't there? Buckingham Palace garden parties. I'd love to show you loads of pictures from Buckingham Palace garden parties, but on everybody's invitation, it says very clearly down the bottom of the invitation, no cameras, please. So I can't really, but I can tell you roughly what would happen. I can tell you that the guests, drawn from the great and the good, are served cups of tea on the lawn at the back of Buckingham Palace. If it's a little bit drafty, they're served in a marquee, or if it's a beautiful sunny day, out on the lawn. They listen to a military band, and the Queen joins them with other members of the royal family at the appointed hour. And sometimes there are special garden parties for very worthwhile organisations. Just a few years ago, for example, I know that the Royal Charter, the British Royal Red Cross was marked by their own garden party. And the second one, surviving members of the Territorial Army, a volunteer force that was in Britain during the Second World War. They had their own garden party. There's another charity, the Not Forgotten Association. They had their own one. And then a fourth one to mark the congregation of the Lambeth Conference for the Church of England. So there's a mixture of reasons why garden parties are done. But another happy event, again in in recent history from Buckingham Palace took place between the 1st and the 4th of June 2002 to celebrate the Queen's Golden Jubilee. And that weekend actually included a classical music concert, which was called Prom at the Palace. And can you believe it? 2 million people applied online to get tickets for that concert. Incredible. So the 12,500 people who actually got tickets to sit within the grounds of Buckingham Palace to listen to some fantastic classical music performed by among the best of contemporary performers. They really were. And then, of course, there's another, that rock and pop concert, the famous Party at the Palace, which was celebrated on the 3rd of June 2002. Another 12,000 people were lucky enough to get into that. That's the one where Ozzy Osbourne stole the show. You remember that? He had his performance. But again, 1 million people gathered around Buckingham Palace to listen to that, and an estimated 200 million people around the world watched that rock and pop concert on TV. So that was one of the many examples when Buckingham Palace really is iconic and ambassadorial for what is the best of the British Isles. And again, another question I'm often asked is, well, within the overall history of Buckingham Palace, what's the history of the changing of the guard ceremony? Perhaps you might be lucky enough to see it when you are in London. I recommend it. It does have a history all its own. The history of changing of the guard goes back to the year 1660. And ever since, the responsibility for changing of the guard has always been given to the 5 infantry regiments of the Guards, and they are the Grenadier, Coldstream, Scots, Irish and Welsh Guards, and alongside them there were the 2 further regiments of the Household Cavalry and the Life Guards as well, and the Blues and Royals. And it's important to remember that these the military people who perform in this ceremony, they are not purely ceremonial soldiers. These guys have seen military service, Iraq, Afghanistan and elsewhere. And the whole point, why do they have the changing of the guard anyway? It's for one guard who has been guarding Buckingham Palace to be relieved by the incoming guard. And so you might hear this event being referred to as the guard mounting. It's just another term for the changing of the guard, exactly the same thing. And by the way, there's also a changing of the guard ceremony at St James's Palace as well. So it's not just Buckingham Palace that is involved in this history. And in all, the changing of the guard ceremony, it takes about 45 minutes. So it is a good show to complete. It happens every day, about 11:30 a.m. between April and the end of July. But don't be disappointed, because it happens on alternate days for the rest of the year, weather permitting. And of course, the incoming guard, they march right up to Buckingham Palace, where they are based, right in central London, where all the Foot Guard battalions on ceremonial duties are situated. And of course, again, thinking about other ceremonial events, the history of Buckingham Palace is inseparable from Trooping of the Colour. You may have seen it on TV or read about it, because it is from Buckingham Palace that the Queen actually starts her journey and then goes down the Mall with the sovereign's escort of the Household Cavalry. But when you think that the Trooping of the Colour, that history actually itself goes back to the year 1748, again, that's a whole load of history that we need to think about. And of course, the point of Trooping the Colour is to celebrate the sovereign's official birthday. Now, this is something else I need to explain, isn't it? What is an official birthday? And how do you get one? Well, the first point to say is that it is not the celebration of the Queen's actual date of her birth. With an official birthday, it's different. An official birthday is a date chosen by each member of the Commonwealth to celebrate the sovereign's birth. So with the Queen, for example, the date of her birth was the 21st of April. But her official birthday is celebrated, last year, on the 9th of June. And the previous year, it was the 10th of June. So you can see it moves around. And in most of Australia, the Queen's official birthday is on the second Monday in June. But in Western Australia, because they think independently, in Western Western Australia, they celebrate it on the last Monday in September. And Canadians do it completely differently as well. The Queen's official birthday there is celebrated on the last Monday before the 25th of May. So official birthdays are celebrated differently around the world. Complicated, isn't it? But for me, one of the most amazing things in the whole history of Buckingham Palace, and it would be wrong of me not to share this with you, is that it really marks one of the great places where the British Royal Collection is housed. It is one of the great collections of art in the world. So I think we need to know a little bit about it. All this art, basically, it offers us a set of windows back in time. And I wanted to say something about it today, just to give you some idea of the size of the British Royal Collection. 7,000 paintings, but I haven't finished my list yet. That doesn't include the 40,000 watercolours and drawings, and I need to add in the 150,000 Old Master prints. But again, I haven't finished yet, because there are all sorts of historical photographs. There are tapestries in there, there's furniture, there's ceramics, of course there's books as well. That also counts, and there's other works of art as well. To be fair, not all the Royal Collection can be fixed into Buckingham Palace, but the Royal Collection is just so big, as I've described there, so a lot of it is spread over to Windsor Castle as well, Sandringham and other royal palaces as well, because like I said, this is a huge art collection. But from the visitor's point of view to Buckingham Palace, I think one of the best ways to see the Royal Collection is actually to go and see it for yourself. Turn up and visit the Queen's Gallery whenever Buckingham Palace is open to the public. And the Queen's Gallery actually was opened in the year 1962. And it was actually built on the site of Buckingham Palace's chapel, which, as I said earlier, that was destroyed by a direct hit in the Second World War. But it's interesting, since the year 1962 until its temporary closure in the year 1999, how many visits do you think it had, that single art collection? How about 5 million? Just shows how iconic and ambassadorial that single art collection is within the whole history of Buckingham Palace. And since it was reopened in the year 2002, it really has been a magnet. If you love art, put that Royal Collection on your list, and I promise you, you won't be disappointed. So today, shall we have a look inside? Just a few small items from the British Royal Collection, because it is part of the history of Buckingham Palace. Now, for me, one of the great pleasures of visiting any art collection, any art gallery, is the prospect of coming across artists who might be unfamiliar to us and whose work is unfamiliar and yet totally amazing. So if we were to imagine ourselves, we had an imaginary tour of the Royal Collection at Buckingham Palace, we might, for example, come across this extraordinary seascape by a painter called John Wilson Carmichael. And as we can see, this artist really understood his subject matter. We actually know from studying the life of John Wilson Carmichael, he started his life not as a painter, he actually started as an apprentice ship's carpenter, and what that gave him was an amazing insight into the realities of ships, the like of which he is painting here. So he has amazing accuracy and understanding of what sailing ships would have looked like. So painted somewhere between, we don't really know, somewhere between 1820 and 1868. This is called The Pursuit, and basically here we have a British sailing ship seeing off, pursuing anyone who might be foolish enough to come along and upset us. Now, another great delight of going into the British Royal Collection or any other collection is the prospect of coming across work by an artist who we know, we recognise his name, we know his work, and yet we see something that we would not associate with this artist. Now, I wonder if anyone can guess who might be the artist here. I'm going to give you a good clue. It's the artist here who painted Monarch of the Glen, Edwin Landseer. And when we turn to another painting by Edwin Landseer, well, we have to say, what on earth is going on here? What's the story? What is the history of this painting? Let's try and work out a few clues, shall we? Let's sort of unpack what we're seeing here. First of all, who was Isaac von Amberg, and what was his association with all these animals? Well, von Amberg was a famous lion tamer of that time, and he was a famous tiger tamer as well. He travelled all over Europe, and he travelled all over the United States as well, and he appeared to have a miraculous ability to control these powerful animals really at his whim. But with all good historians, let's dig a little bit further into his technique, shall we? And we find that he actually controlled these beautiful animals by cruelty and starvation. So I really think that Edwin Landseer is showing us a protest painting here. He was protesting against the techniques of Isaac von Amberg, protesting against the cruelty and torment. And it's exactly consistent with his Monarch of the Glen. In both paintings, I think he is just showing us the reality, the beauty of animals that should never be taken for granted and certainly never be subjected to cruelty in any way. Let's move away from paintings now. I said that the Royal Collection in Buckingham Palace has some extraordinary items. I'm going to move to furniture now. I'm going to show you one of the best examples of English furniture, as I said, from the Royal Collection in Buckingham Palace. What we're seeing here is a cabinet made by Robert Hume in around the year 1820. Now, the reason why I really like this piece is a celebration of the brilliance of English furniture making, really at its highest standard. The main woods are oak and ebony. The cabinet also includes tortoiseshell, brass and pewter as well. The top of the cabinet is made of marble, and gilt bronze also finishes it off magnificently. So while we're thinking of all things to do with the history of Buckingham Palace, the history of the British Isles, this is a celebration of what British furniture making can be. But this guy, Robert Hume, who was he? Well, he was a cabinet maker of the highest calibre. You can tell that by the astonishing brilliance of his work. He was a wood carver. He was a gilder as well. But he did the whole business because he was a furniture dealer as well. So he made the stuff and he sold it too. One day in 1825, he just happened to meet King George IV. King George IV liked the cabinet and bought it. So that's how it entered into the Royal Collection. Shall we change the tone away? I've taken one case study of painting, one case study of furniture. Let's look at some ceramics, some Chelsea porcelain as well. Again, it has a rightful place within the history of Buckingham Palace and a dazzling place within the Royal Collection. So let's dig into the history, the story behind this English porcelain. Now, the first thing that we can see is there's 137 items of Chelsea porcelain alone in the Royal Collection. So that would be a lecture on itself. But today, I'm just going to pick out a few details from this one. But the name Mecklenburg, it's a dinner and dessert service. Mecklenburg, that is not an English name by any chance, is it? So we have to do some more digging into the history. And we find out, that it was commissioned by George III and his wife, Queen Charlotte, and then it was actually given to the Queen's brother, and the Queen's brother had that title of the Duke of Mecklenburg Strelitz. So that's why today it is known as the Mecklenburg porcelain. But then let's carry on with that story, because we find that this piece was actually bought for the present monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, to mark her 25th wedding anniversary. That's a pretty good present, really, isn't it? But let's carry on following up the stories, the histories behind this single piece within the overall story of the history of Buckingham Palace. Because a piece as extraordinary as this, it raises lots of fascinating questions, doesn't it? So we can learn about the history and the richness. For example, this sumptuous, rich blue that decorates this porcelain. What can we say about that? Well, it has its own name, Mazarine blue. It really is very, very rich, isn't it? there. It lends an air of distinction. But here's another question. Perhaps you can't really see, but I'll tell you. There's a lot of silver, which has been not painted, but actually silver, which has been woven within this porcelain. Why might that be? Because when you actually see it up close, it really is there. Well, the manager of the Chelsea porcelain factory that made this piece of porcelain, when it was finished in March 1765, we know his name, Nicholas Sprymount. And we know that his background, he was a fully trained silversmith. So he was never shy, ladies and gentlemen, in allowing the craft of the silversmith just to be woven in, not so subtly, into the work of the porcelain. So it celebrates all that English porcelain work can be. Time is against me, but I'm just going to finish one very brief mention. We've gone through furniture and porcelain and paintings and all the rest of it. I haven't mentioned sculpture yet. This is not in a public area, but we are Viking, ladies and gentlemen, and we have privileged access, don't we? So if we were to quietly wander off away from the other members of the public on a tour, and we were to go away into one of the state apartments within Buckingham Palace, we would see this lady. The sculpture is of Dirkie by Antonio Canova. It was completed in the year 1824. But who was Dirkie? Well, basically, on the surface of things, she looks really serene, doesn't she? Really imposing. But in actual fact, she was a complicated lady, a lady from classical mythology who was very cruel, very judgmental. I won't go into the sordid details of her story, but the point I'm making to you is that behind all this serenity and grace, there is something more unsettling to that. So there's a complicated history there, as there has been in all the stories. So really, to sum up, I hope I've convinced you, ladies and gentlemen, that if you're not sure what you want to do when you're in London, can I suggest you put Buckingham Palace on your list? It is an extraordinary building. It does embody extraordinary stories within it. 800 members of staff are there to make it all work. And of course, its vital statistics amaze people. 1,514 doors. How many windows? 760 windows. How often are they cleaned? Every 6 weeks. How many light bulbs are there in Buckingham Palace? 40,000, give or take one or two. So it is a place to marvel at, to enjoy, and I think to learn the history of Buckingham Palace. It really is the unfinished work of a lifetime. Tomorrow I hope to tell you the story of Windsor Castle, if there is time. But for me, I'm so grateful to you for giving me your time this evening and for listening to this talk. So thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.